All right, everybody. Well, thank you very much for coming on the call this evening. My name is Matt Barton, and I'm the new urban conservation specialist at the St. Louis Audubon Society. And in that capacity, one of my roles is to help with our Bird Safe St. Louis program, which we're all here tonight to discuss. So tonight we'll go over a few different topics related to the BirdSafe program. First, we'll talk about some of the risks that migratory birds face. We'll also talk about the BirdSafe project specifically and some of its past findings. We'll discuss our survey protocol and how to log observations in our iNaturalist project. And then finally, we'll talk about the next steps for the season, and we will talk about any questions that might come up along the way. So I wanted to start the presentation by showing this picture. This is of City Garden in downtown St. Louis. If you're not familiar, it's a pretty nice little park, sculpture park area. It's just to the west of Keener Plaza, so right there in the heart of downtown St. Louis. And when you look at the picture of it, you can see why it would be attractive to birds. You can see there's a lot of trees over there that would provide good habitat. It's a good place for a migrating bird to, take a rest as they're traveling on their route. There's also good resources there like food and shelter. But when you look at the picture a little further, you might notice there's kind of some odd little things about it. For example, you can see up here, there's this little dot, and there's another here. And the reason for that is there's a little more to this picture than meets the eye, because this is not a picture directly of City Garden. It's actually a picture of a reflection of City Garden. And so there is some context of what it actually looks like reflecting off the side of the building. So I think this is a good kind of warm up as far as, what situation birds are facing as they come into our urban landscape in St. Louis. At first, it's some of you might not have noticed that, this is in fact a reflection on the left versus, when you zoom out and get the context of the photo, you can pretty clearly see. So bird populations are facing a crisis, not just, around the world, but also here in North America. So Cornell Bird Labs has found that there's been a loss of 29% of our bird population since 1970. And there's a lot of aspects that contribute to that, things like habitat loss, changing climate conditions, which in turn can exacerbate habitat loss. There's also cat predation, not only from feral cats, but also domestic cats that are allowed to roam freely. And then, of course, collisions, which is what we are primarily focusing on addressing through the BirdSafe St. Louis program. And so every year, 3 to 5 billion birds migrate through the United States and Canada during their spring and fall migrations. 70% of North American bird species are migratory, and of that of that total, 80% of those birds that are migratory will migrate at night. And a lot of people might not realize that there's these massive migrations going on overnight, but there are some reasons why. One is that it's cooler temperatures at nighttime, so there's less stress, while you're migrating and flying. There's going to be fewer predators along the way, such as maybe hawks or other birds of prey that could bother birds as they migrate. And then also birds do use celestial bodies and take cues from those, such as the star and moon, to help aid in their navigation. And there's four primary flyways here in the United States. As you can see on the screen, we have the Pacific, the Central, the Mississippi, and the Atlantic. The red star there in the Mississippi Flyway shows our location, which is right there in the center of the Mississippi Flyway. And the Mississippi Flyway is really an important migratory pathway for birds. 60% of North American songbirds use the Mississippi Flyway in migration, 40% of North American waterfowl. And so that's representing over 325 different species of birds. In the flyway, there's also valuable resources for birds, such as the Mississippi River and everything that it provides, as well as the Missouri River. And during the spring, migration will peak here generally in the first couple weeks of May. And during the spring, the birds are typically moving north. And then in the fall, migration is a bit more drawn out, and it can move from the July through November. But as far as what we do to try to mitigate that during those kind of heavier migration periods, one effort aside from collision reduction is we also encourage lights out. And in the spring, the lights out campaign is during May. And in the fall, we observe that during September. And a lot of great work is done in the bi-state area by the Lights Out Heartland program. That's part of Dark Sky, Missouri. And that is encouraging cities and municipalities, as well as specific building owners, to take action to help cut down light pollution. And St. Louis, unfortunately, is a rather dangerous city for migrating birds. So we have a couple of maps here that this was compiled by Cornell University. And in their study, they looked to assess, how dangerous different cities are for birds. They looked at a number of different factors, things such as light pollution, the geography of the area, and then also radar data. There are programs through Cornell University like BirdCast that use radar signatures to help assess where birds are migrating, how many of them are migrating during these peak migration periods. And when they took all of that data and put it together, they determined that St. Louis is the fifth most dangerous city for migrating birds during the spring, and it's also the sixth most dangerous during the fall. So unfortunately, that's not a distinction that we want to have, but that's why it's important for us in particular to, get involved and make an effort to help these birds. And so the average estimate is that we have around 600 million birds that are killed annually in building collisions. That's the average statistic. Some places say up to as many as 1 billion birds are dying yearly in these collisions. And it's not necessarily just large buildings that are having issues. It also, these small low-rise buildings classified as under 3 stories also represent a large risk to these birds. So that's in parts why it's important for everyone to get involved. It's not just a matter of these large buildings, it's also things that you can do at your own house. And just kind of why, again, the light is such a problem. It can interfere with the birds as they're navigating. The bright lights can draw birds in and confuse them and cause them to circle over buildings that are brightly illuminated. Those lights then that are drawing them in, they're, drawing them towards more populated areas with a lot of light pollution. And the issue is, and the danger is magnified on nights and when there's bad weather, low cloud ceiling, and just kind of refracting that light around. And so just to kind of touch on a little further, there was a study with Cornell Ornithology Lab and the Field Museum in Chicago, And they looked at a bunch of different information of data of 2 decades worth of collision data, weather and migration. And a few of the things that they found is that there's a few things that really affect how many collisions they're seeing. One is going to be the magnitude of how many birds are passing through that night of migration. There's going to be the output of the light from these buildings. And then wind conditions also do play an important factor in how the birds are, getting from point to point, and sometimes those conditions are less favorable. But as far in terms of light, after this study, they found that when they have the light that was coming out from these buildings, in the spring, it was reducing the window collisions 11-fold and in 6-fold in the fall. So it just goes to show again that, light pollution is one way that we can help address bird collision. And then aside from light pollution, there's also dangers that are posed just by architecture. Birds typically are not going to see glass as a barrier like you or I would. Um, and there's a couple of problems with different materials. You'll have situations where it's a matter of reflections that are either showing more vegetation or an open sky and reflecting it, almost giving a kind of infinity view of the horizon. And that you can see in the top picture. You can see in this glass all the trees reflecting on those panes. And that would be a risk to birds, because a bird would possibly see that and think, hey, this isn't actually a reflection. It's a tree that I can go land in and take shelter. You also have issues with transparency in materials, and in areas. So like in this picture below, you can see this glass canyon walkway, and you can see that you can pretty easily see through there. So a bird might see that area and just not identify there's, again, anything there. And instead of, trying to fly to perch in a tree or something like that, they might just try to fly through and, again, collide with the building. And so here's actually a couple of examples of some material as far as, reflectivity. These are actually a few pictures of some buildings that we survey in downtown Clayton. And I took these pictures actually just last week when I was down there walking the route to see how everything looked. So when I was walking by, I was just really struck by it. Almost is it becomes very difficult very quickly to see where the building starts and ends. You have buildings reflecting reflections of each other. It's really just kind of a mess. And then you can also see in the picture on the left, we have another one of those glass canyons connecting the two buildings. So that's just additional and unfortunate obstruction. So now to the BirdSafe project, more largely. It was established, the surveys began in 2020, when the need was realized that we needed to start tracking these collisions that people knew were happening in the area. And so one of our goals is to establish long-term community relationships that support bird safe practices and reduce bird fatalities due to light pollution, like we've spoke about, buildings and windows collisions. So the project, what we're trying to do is collect data on the where, when, and who is colliding with the different windows, so that we can try to approach property managers and other stakeholders with targeted actions to prevent bird mortalities, and also not just identify the problem, but work with them to try to provide solutions and actions that we might be able to help them with to reduce these collisions. So as I mentioned, the downtown St. Louis surveys, they started in the fall of 2020. We did have it they went into spring 2024, but spring 2024 was somewhat of a reduced year because we only did part of the spring surveys downtown. But in that time frame, there's been 1,124 observations recorded in the iNaturalist project, representing 85 different species of birds. And down here, you can see a little infographic about the different birds that we're seeing most frequently over that period of time in our collisions. And this data is for strikes on buildings in downtown St. Louis. This is from fall 2023 since we did a full survey season down there. But you can see that there's a lot of variability between these buildings and how many collisions that they're seeing. And it doesn't always necessarily correlate with height. For example, the tallest building in downtown St. Louis is the Metropolitan Square. But you can see here that actually, relative to some of the other buildings, it has relatively few strikes. Whereas Bank of America, the building that I started my presentation with, it has an inordinate amount of strikes, likely due to building materials and then also the proximity to green spaces such as City Garden. And so strikes in the spring, they are happening a lot. This is in the fall data. They're happening a lot on the north sides of buildings. So moving to some information from downtown Clayton, we actually did our first and only survey so far there in the spring of 2024. In that time, we recorded 42 observations, and that represented 17 different species of birds. And again, you have the infographic here just kind of showing what we've encountered down there so far. And then here is a little comparison of the strikes by building in Clayton. As you can see here, 1 North Brentwood so far has been the site at which we've seen the most strikes. It also is in very close proximity to Shaw Park. So there is probably a correlate or a connection between that proximity to a spot that birds would find very attractive, and the number of collisions that are occurring there. So really quickly, before we get into the more of the actual fall protocol for this season, is there any questions that anyone might have so far or would like to shout out? Going once, going twice. All right. All right. So the fall protocol for this year. Oop. There we go. All right. So this fall, we are actually going to do surveys in Clayton and also downtown St. Louis. And this is the first time that we're going to try to do two surveys concurrently at different sites. And there's a few reasons for that. So Clayton, why we started surveying there in the spring 2024 is that we're seeing an increasing amount of developments in Clayton, and there's just a lot of construction that's happening in the area. So we're putting up more buildings and obstacles in the path of the migrating birds. We also decided to survey Clayton due to their possible receptiveness of taking action with our recommendations. Being a smaller municipality than the city of St. Louis, it's easier probably for them to implement changes and not have so much of a bureaucratic process to go through. So as far as why we decided also to go back to downtown St. Louis this fall, obviously we know that there's a problem there, a big problem, and we're seeing a lot of collisions. And the data set, bears that out. But we'd also like to go back to downtown St. Louis because it does give us the ability to do some interesting comparisons. It's another data set that then we can use to make some comparisons between the two different sites. So for example, if there was a survey, when we're looking at the data for our surveys in Clayton, if we notice a day that has a particularly high strike occurrence, we could also then look at our data for downtown to see, well, was there also, a spike in that location at that time? So there's a lot of interesting ways that we can do some analysis once and do some comparisons once we have those two data sets. And so below here, the graphic is an image of our survey site in downtown Clayton. And you can see there are the blue buildings here. Those are the buildings that we're specifically targeting as far as we're going to survey around them. And then you'll also see that there are some darker blue borders around these buildings as well. And the darker blue outline is showing generally where the building is accessible. There's some places that some buildings have courtyards or fenced off areas or just generally inaccessible. And so you can use the map to use those borders as a guide to show you where and how to get around the buildings. And so when a bird is found, the first thing you're going to want to do is get some photographs of it. And we do want to have photos from multiple angles. So a top-down shot or a dorsal shot, a shot from the underside or ventral, a side view, a clear view of the head, and then also a context shot, which we'll get into a little further down the line here. And the reason that we're taking so many photographs and from so many angles, is that we want to be able to see as much of the bird as we can. Birds have different patterns and markings, and those can be used to help with identification and distinguish them from one species versus another. One that I can think of here off the top of my head would maybe be a hairy versus a downy woodpecker. You could, with a clear shot of the head, you would get a nice view of its bill, and the proportion of that bill size to its head can help you distinguish which species you might be looking at. And then we'll take that information and we'll use it to add observation to our iNaturalist projects for these areas. So a bit more on a context shot. The idea is that you are taking a picture of the bird in the setting in which it's found versus the pictures just specifically of the bird. So when we take the context shots, you'll place a small cone near the bird, like you can see in these three pictures. And that's so that when someone's looking at this context photo, they can quickly see where the bird is. Some birds are very small, like warblers. So when you're taking a larger context shot, it's kind of easy for a small object like a bird to get lost. So this helps us home in on where exactly the bird is in the photograph. And we do have cones that we will supply to volunteers so that they can take their context shots. And so here is an example of the different shots. And then, so on the top left, you have the dorsal or that top view. Bottom left, we have a side view. The center is a headshot where you're getting a bit closer in there and trying to get some of those features. The top right, we have the ventral or the underside view. And then bottom right, we have our context shot. So like I mentioned, we're taking this information and we are adding it to our iNaturalist projects. And I'm sure that some of you are familiar already with the iNaturalist app. But if you're not, it's an app and a website that is all basically citizen science for almost anything that you can imagine related to nature. So in their own words, iNaturalists say that they're a crowdsourced species identification system and an organism occurrence recording tool. And it really is a great tool for people who are interested in doing surveys. It's very good for recording observations. It also helps with doing identifications. When we make our observations in our projects, anybody that's on iNaturalist can come and look at the individual observations and help us and our project by helping to identify the birds. And it's also a good place to collaborate and basically work towards a common goal, like our projects. And it's also useful because we can easily pull data from iNaturalist for further analysis. It can be exported out. And then, of course, it's just generally more green and eco-friendly than using paper slips like we have done in the past for some of our surveys. And so for our projects, you will need a smartphone. And that in the event that you don't have a smartphone, that's okay. That doesn't mean that you're excluded from surveys. All that means is that we'll need to make sure that whoever you're partnered with to do surveys has a smartphone so that the data can be logged while you're all out doing your observations. In the event that you haven't used iNaturalist in the past, you'll want to go to their website, which is inaturalist.org. You'll create a free account, and then you'll also want to go ahead and download the iNaturalist app to your phone. And in the Android store, Google Play Store rather, that is what the icon looks like for the app in case you are trying to find it. And so now we'll just kind of go through an example of what it's like to log an observation into our project. So like we discussed a little earlier, the first thing you're going to want to do when you see a bird is you'll go over and you'll start taking your photographs. I would recommend just instead of doing any sort of photography within the app, I would just take pictures like you normally would with your camera phone. Once you have your pictures, you'll open the app and you'll see the home screen, and there will be an option to add an observation. On the Android app and the Apple app are very similar, so there shouldn't be a lot of differences. But as far as the Android app, the add observation button, it looks like a small green circle with a plus sign. And once you have that, you'll say add observations, and it'll pull up, like in this picture here, it'll pull up a photo reel of all the different pictures you have. And what you'll do is you'll just select all of the pictures that you want to include for your observation. And just as a reminder, we want to have those 4 different shots of the bird specifically, and then we want to have the context shot. And so in the left image, you can see those little blue check marks, which is showing that I've got 5 pictures selected to add to that observation. And then you would just go ahead and click the little button add. And from there, it's going to actually bring you into your observation for the project, which is the image on the right. So up here, you can see where those pictures that I had selected are at. And so we'll just kind of go down the screen here now, and I'll explain what some of the little fields are. So what did you see? That is where you're going to put in, well, what you saw. If you are comfortable with bird identification and you know what exactly it is species-wise, you're more than free to go ahead and ID it right out of the gate. If you're unsure or you just don't have a lot of experience in bird identification, you can, in that field, you would just type bird. And that's just kind of a catch-all so that different projects and people who are observing projects can filter and say, I want to look at bird observations. So from there, once you've selected either a species or a bird, the next section down is notes. And in the notes section, that's just basically anything that you want me and the project coordinators to know about the observation. So some things that you might include in notes are if you find a bird that's stunned versus collided and died, you might put in the note section that, the bird was still alive and that it, and put some notes about its condition. The notes section is also used when we have what's called an incidental find, which we'll get into a little further here in the presentation. But generally, anything that you think is important or noteworthy, you can put that in the notes and we'll be able to see that. The next field down is your time. So it's just basically your clock showing what time the observation was, taken. Next down is geolocation. So the app will use your location to say, this is where the collision occurred at or where we found the bird. And most of the time, your phone will already be doing that. If you happen to see that it just says location there, you can click on that and go into an actual map and find where you are. Or sometimes if it didn't want to do it automatically, you can press the geolocate button within that subscreen and it will hone in on where you are. Location visibility. We want that to be open, and that's for a few reasons. That's so that other people can help use or can use our data as well to make conclusions. For example, with our data, one thing that we do is we report that to an organization called the Global Bird Collision Mapper. And what they do is they aggregate information from all over the country and world about where collisions are happening. So it's a useful project for many individual programs like ours to send their data somewhere larger that maybe we can get a larger picture of what exactly is happening. Capture or cultivated, we won't use that. And then finally, the last picture here is add to projects. So once you've gone down to that point, you'll click add to projects, and that'll take you to the next screen. And that is the image here on the left. So what will happen is if you are new to iNaturalist, you won't really have many projects in there unless you've joined others. So what we'll do is once we've got you confirmed as a volunteer, we'll add you to our iNaturalist projects. As you can see here, we've got one for downtown Clayton and one for downtown St. Louis. And so right out of the gate, it's an important step for you to select the correct location that you're at. And there's a few reasons for that. One is that the building maps that populate in each project are exclusive to that specific site. So if you were in downtown St. Louis and you tried to but you were actually in the Clayton project, when you tried to find the Bank of America building, it wouldn't be in your drop-down list because you're in the wrong project. And so that's usually a way that really quick you can tell, am I in the right project or not? If you can't find the name of your building, you're probably going to be in the wrong project, but that's simple to change. All you have to do is use the little check boxes here to select which one you are, and you can toggle that. So if you accidentally selected downtown St. Louis's project, but you're in Clayton, you can uncheck that and then check downtown Clayton. So in this example, we're talking about Clayton. So I have the Clayton project selected in the picture on the right. The first field that we'll look at is building. And so what you'll do is you'll just click that field and you can see that it drops down all of those specific Clayton buildings that we're watching in the project. And what you'll use is that initial site map that I showed you a few slides back to locate where you are and the name of the building, and then you'll select that name. In the event that you have an incidental find or it's a situation where it's not at one of our target buildings, there is an option for other, and that's what you would select in those circumstances. Next field down is going to be, you'll indicate what side of the building. So you can see here, we've just got the different directions that you might log. And from there, you'll just select that. And so incidental find here, and that's something I've kind of mentioned a few times in the call. So an incidental find is when you locate a collision that's either between the buildings that we're specifically surveying or around a building that we're not particularly surveying. So that's a yes or no field. So if you found it between a survey building or you found the bird around a non-target building, you would choose yes for that field. Next down, we have distance. You don't have to do a exact measurement. You don't need to do anything like a tape measure or anything like that. You can just walk off the distance and make your best estimate as far as how far away that bird is from where they collided with the building. And you'll want to measure that in feet and inches. And while you're trying to gauge where the collision occurred, you'll want to look at up and around at the surroundings. Some buildings will have a facade that protrudes in front of the building. So there's a chance that, a bird might have hit a higher level that was sticking out versus the main part of the building at the ground level. So you want to look around and just make sure that you're trying to do your best to ascertain where exactly that bird hit and make your measurement from there. And then the last field that you'll need to fill out is possible predation. And so it's also going to be a yes or no question. And you'll want to choose yes if it appears that the bird is not the result of a collision, but actually a predatory attempt. So that's a new field that we added this year just to try to filter out some information a little more accurately so that we're not necessarily counting predatory, natural predatory events as in our collision statistics. So that just kind of helps us filter the information a little more accurately. So some signs that you might have a predation event. You might find a bird that's missing its head. You might find a bird that's been partially consumed. You might find a bird that it's not a whole bird, like perhaps just a wing. All of those would suggest that that bird has probably been preyed upon. If you're in doubt and you're not sure and you're on the fence, you can choose yes for that. And that'll be a flag for myself and other coordinators that we can look at the specific pictures that you took during your observation and try to make a determination on whether we think that is in fact a collision or a predatory event. So those are the main questions. And once you're done with that, so on the picture on the left here, you can see we've got all of those different fields filled in for the Clayton post. You would just click that check mark up here by the yellow arrow, and that will take you back to the main observation screen. So now over here, you can see all that screen we were on earlier, all that information we had filled out, and now you'll see a 1 next to the project. So that's showing that we've added that to our Clayton project. And to finalize everything and post that to our observations, you would just hit the green check mark and you've completed your first observation. Um, I know that that can sound like it's a lot of information, um, but once you've actually played around in the app a little bit, and especially once you've gone out and made your first observation, I feel like it is really intuitive after that. Um, as far as the app, it really is not very buggy. There aren't a lot of issues. Um, there's a lot of little fail safes built in as far as, we have some fields set up as required. So if you try to go further in your observation without filling in the field, it'll stop you to remind you that you need to complete that part of the observation. So it really is a pretty user-friendly program, and it's a really great tool for us. So now, I'll just touch very briefly here on the downtown St. Louis survey site. By and large, almost all of the observation fields and things that you're recording in downtown Clayton are the same things that you'll record in downtown St. Louis. So here is a map of where we're going to survey this fall downtown. The one building that we are going to also survey that I just need to update the map here will be 1 North Broadway. And when I send out the survey location maps, that will all be updated and good to go there. So the downtown St. Louis project, it's basically that exact same process, except when you fill out everything until you get to the project page, and now you would select the BirdSafeSTL, which is our downtown project. And all the fields are going to be the same, except there are a couple that aren't, which I have these little yellow arrows pointing to. One of them is carcass information. This season, that is always going to be no. In the past, we have done some efforts where we've collected carcasses for educational purposes in taxidermy. We aren't doing anything like that currently. So this field is more historic, and it's going to default to no, and you can the answer is no. The other piece that we collect in downtown for a handful of buildings, it's this field section of building. And you can see here under that particular field, it lists the buildings that this applies to. So that's the Bank of America Tower, the Spire Building, KSDK, and 100 North Broadway. So how you do that field for the downtown project is each of those 4 buildings has a secondary map that we will also provide. And these buildings are pretty large, and we do see a fair amount of collisions around them. So by using these sections and parsing the building into these sections, it helps us narrow down exactly where the collisions are happening at these large sites. And the idea of that is that in a situation where there's maybe limited resources to do treatments for windows, we can work with the property manager then to say, thank you very much for your willingness to help. And here are the areas that are, the most troublesome at the site, so that we can really target in where we're applying treatments and what we're doing, instead of just haphazardly trying to say, well, try to do it all. So here's an example of one of the section maps in downtown. You can see here, they're pretty simple. This is for the Spire Building. And what you would just do is, as you're walking around one of these buildings, when you make that observation, say you found a bird here, just at this section, what you would do is you would fill out Spire-UW3, and that would be that field of the section map. So we try to label these pretty clearly. They are pretty accurate as far as this map really does. If you've ever been to the Spire Building, it really does do a good job of segmenting the building and showing where you're going to be. for points of reference and orienting yourself as well, we try to put directions and roads around so that you can get an idea of where, where you are relative to the building. So just some frequently asked questions that we usually get. So I figured I would try to get ahead of those. So how long does a survey take? The answer is that's going to vary, which isn't a very exact answer. Average time is probably around an hour and a half, but it's going to depend on a number of factors. One will be the number of collisions that happen to occur that previous night. As some previous volunteers can tell you, some days you'll go out on a survey and you'll find no birds. Other days you'll go out and you'll find, a couple handfuls of birds. So, I mean, that's, one of the things that's going to cause a lot of variability. Factors also of how fast you walk also will depend on how quickly you walk the route. So what do we do with the birds after we've done our observation and taken our pictures? So the answer to that is we dispose of them in the trash. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is it's just simply sanitary. If there's dead birds on the ground, it's not sanitary. It draws in unwanted pests such as mice and other scavengers that might be drawn in. So it's just general cleanliness for one. But that also, disposing of the birds helps us prevent the risk of a collision accidentally being double counted. Since we'll be surveying over a period of time, there's a chance that if you didn't dispose of the bird that you recorded as an observation, that the next group of surveyors that come a day or two down the line will also find that bird and double count it, which we want to avoid for the sake of data accuracy. As far as gloves, do you wear gloves? That's a personal choice. I typically do personally. If you don't wear gloves, we would definitely recommend using hand sanitizer after handling the birds. I think that's just, good protocol in general when interacting with wild animals, that you want to be sanitary and follow good sanitary practices. If you do wear gloves, possibly consider using a glove that is reusable or could be sanitized. That way, we're not using single-use gloves like a disposable nitrile glove that you might find at a doctor's office. Any way that we can, reduce our footprint as a group is great. Paper forms, as I mentioned in the past, a lot of when we did surveys, surveyors did have a little paper slip that they would fill out for their observations, and they would photograph that along with the birds for our records. Now that we're on our iNaturalist projects, it really cuts out the need for any of that because all of the data is logged in the project. It's accessible and easy to get. All of the photography is there as well. So it's a good repository for the information. As far as the maps, like I mentioned, I'm going to be sending all of those out so that everybody has copies. You can use your phone, have that on your phone. If you do, I would recommend downloading the attachment instead of maybe just using your browser. Sometimes when you're downtown or in Clayton with some of the larger buildings, it could interfere with your phone signal potentially. So if you have it downloaded, less risk of not having a connection and kind of being in the dark. I usually typically bring a paper copy with me just in case there's some sort of, tech failure and I can't get the map for whatever reason. I've still got a map with me and I can use that. And then injured and stunned birds. So a lot of the birds that you're going to encounter are going to be deceased. But there is a possibility that you'll come across a bird that has collided and it's survived and maybe it's stunned. a lot of this with injured and stunned birds, it's going to be a judgment call, depending on what you kind of think about the condition of the bird. What I might say, it looks like, that I would say, oh, this bird's just stunned versus it needs attention. It could vary from person to person. If you find a stunned bird and it's not in immediate peril, like an extremely obvious injury, but it's in like a compromising position, like maybe right by the road or exposed to predators, you can consider moving it to a safer location, like maybe some landscaping or like under a shrub, just somewhere to give it a little cover. And if you're concerned, you can always come back a little later and see if the bird has, regained its composure and was able to move on. If you happen to encounter a bird that is visibly injured and is going to need help, you can contact a rehabber. And luckily for us in St. Louis, we have a lot of great organizations that do great rehab work. In the event that you find an injured songbird, which is going to be 99.9% of the birds in our surveys, you would want to reach out to Wild Bird Rehab. In the event that you find an injured raptor, such as a falcon, a hawk, something like that, your rehabber to contact would be the World Bird Sanctuary. I'm not entirely certain on what the protocols are at Wild Bird Rehab, but for World Bird Sanctuary, what you would want to do is you would call in, talk to the folks in the hospital and explain what the situation is. They will likely have you send them some pictures so that they can get a visual on the bird and see what's going on. In the event that they decide the bird needs to be brought in for further assessment and see how it's doing, they will work with their rescue and transport team, usually, to line up a volunteer to come out and assist you in getting the bird, at which point they will take that out to World Bird Sanctuary for observation and whatever care it might need. So with all that said, just kind of our next steps and where we're going, I will send out a sign-up calendar for this season. It's going to be a Google Sheet, and it'll have a calendar on there. Each day, when we have a survey, we're looking for at least 2 people to conduct them. So when you're looking at the calendar, if you see openings, you're more than welcome to add your name, and you're free to sign up for as many days as you'd like. Ideally, everybody's first survey, if you're a new person, will be with someone who's done the protocol return before, so a returning participant. And that can be either participated in downtown St. Louis or downtown Clayton. And once you've signed up for a date, as that date approaches, you'll want to coordinate with the other person who has signed up to volunteer with you for the survey and decide where and when you want to meet. So the recommended start time would be probably between 6 and 6:30. And there's a couple of reasons why we want to start early. One is that we want to go out and do our survey before any potential maintenance or grounds crews for buildings go out and potentially collect the birds before we get there. I know I can think of a particular building downtown where unfortunately there is a gentleman on the grounds crew that every morning he goes around and looks for collisions to sweep up. So the other reason is that we would want to go early is to try to find the bird as quickly to when it collided as possible so that there's less chance of possible scavengers coming around and interfering. As far as parking in Clayton, a really popular starting point seems to be right by the library there, the North Central Library. There's a nice parking lot right there as well, and the meters are free before 8 a.m. There also is a residential street just to the north of the library that there's some street parking as well. For downtown St. Louis, it's pretty much all metered parking, and that is also free before 8 a.m. If you're there downtown St. Louis, it's also free on Sundays, but not Saturdays. And so as far as, going out and doing your survey, both participants that are doing the survey can make posts into the iNaturalist project. But again, so that we're not double counting, um, you only one post in the or one observation per bird. So if you all want to, decide that someone's going to be the person logging and or some you want to take turns, it doesn't matter just as long as we're only doing one observation per bird. You can take photos of stunned birds that you encounter. You just would probably want to put that in the notes to indicate that it was stunned just for clarity of information. There are a chance that people will come up to you while you're surveying and ask, what you're doing. So we do offer some name tags, which I will get your feedback on if you would like one of those that we can provide so that it gives you a little more air of officialness. A lot of times I just tell people, I'm with a volunteer with the St. Louis Audubon Society, and we're out here doing collision monitoring to see what's happening during migration. And a lot of times, like people, that's enough to open up a conversation. And a lot of times people are either interested or will be quick to tell you about, oh, I remember when a bird hit my sliding door, like, a cardinal hit my sliding door last month and I'm so sad. People care about birds and usually they'll want to talk about it when they find out what you're doing. If you're ever in a situation where you feel it's compromising, please leave and just let me know. This is we don't want anybody. There's never been any problems in the past, and we don't want you to put yourself in a dangerous or compromising position. It's not the end of the world if we don't get the observation. Your safety is of the highest importance in this effort. And then you'll just want to make sure that you survey all of the buildings on the route. And like we kind of discussed, some days you'll see one bird, some days you'll see no birds, and some days you'll have more. So what's next? I will be sending out a Google form after the meeting just to request some general information from you. Again, one thing I'll ask is your iNaturalist account name. That way I can add you to our projects. You will have to be added in order to make observations. We'll ask for your phone number so that we'll have a good point of contact. That will be your phone number will get shared in a document amongst our group of surveyors, just that way that people are able to get in contact with each other and coordinate, hey, we're going to meet at X time, X location. I will also be sending out copies of this presentation and all of the different maps that you might need. And we'll also just ask what days you think you might be able to survey. That's, it's nothing set in stone. We just want to kind of get an idea of what days might work for the most amount of surveyors. And so, yeah, the sign-up calendar is going to go out in the next couple of days. The survey period that we're looking at this year, we're going to try to start around the 1st of September here and run through around the 15th of October. If there's, more interest in people continuing to survey later, we can always discuss that. It'll just kind of depend on level of interest, but that's the primary survey period that we're looking at currently. All right, and with that is all I really have. If there's any questions or concerns or comments, we can go ahead and go over those now. I'll also pull up the chat here so I can take a look and see if there's any questions here. So I see Valerie asked, is the Gateway Arch studied? So we don't specifically do surveys at the Arch. I'm not certain on what the rules on that might be. We typically, I think probably one of the reasons we don't is they're on the arch grounds. There's really, aside from the arch, not a lot to collide with. Um, Also, they do, of course, try to take steps during some of the heavier periods of migration with lights out heartland. The arch is one of the locations that participates during that effort. So during the month of September, if you happen to drive downtown in the evening and you notice that there's no lights on the arch, that is why. And then, yeah, so will we collect stunned and living birds? Yes. If you think that a bird is in need of attention, we'll have you contact a rehabber, or if you want to reach out to me, I'm happy to help with that. Um, as far as if you have like a small bird, like a songbird that you need to like transport to wildlife rehab, uh, one way that you can do that is if you happen to bring like a sandwich bag, like a brown paper bag, you can gently place a bird in there, and if you just crimp the top, not tightly, you want to not seal them in there really tight. But a lot of times when the birds are in a dark environment like that and enclosed, they'll be rather docile and easy to transport. So that will be helpful. So I also see Valerie. She is a volunteers over at Wildlife Rescue, and she said that it looks like their protocol is also call ahead and send pictures. Uh, do we contact the buildings in advance to let them know that we're doing surveys? We don't specifically go out and let them know that we're going to be coming. Um, a lot of the security personnel and people that work at the buildings will kind of become aware that they'll see people, all of us kind of going out and doing similar things during the survey season. A lot of times security guards don't ask, but typically if they do, it seems like they kind of start to say, oh, it must be the people with Audubon going out and doing a survey. So a lot of times you don't get approached very often, but luckily when you do, it seems to be from a perspective of interest and care, and not so much a confrontational situation. So yeah, I see a question here. So will the sign-up sheet indicate which people are experienced versus rookies? Yes. So I'll get into that when I send the calendar out, but just kind of to discuss it here as well. What we'll do is when you're signing up on the calendar, we will have you put, when you sign your name or fill your name into that blank, we'll have you either put an N as in new, or we will have you put an R for returner next to your name. So that way you can easily tell, is the person that, is due to work with me someone that, is experienced and they can take me if I'm a new person, or any circumstances like that. If you'd like to volunteer and you're not sure about it, who to participate with, for your first time, I'm more than happy to come out and be the returner on your first walk. So feel free to reach out to me, and I'm more than happy to fill that role for you. All right. Does anybody else have any other questions, concerns? Okay, well, in the event that you want to get in touch with me, please feel free. And here is my contact information. I'll go ahead and just leave that up here as people, filter out, so that anybody that wants it can write it down. My contact information is also available on the St. Louis Audubon Society's website. In case you lose any of my contact information at any time, I'm easy to get in touch with.